back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and congratulations me on 20,000 subscribers. I don't talk about, my subscriber count that much on my channel, but 20,000 is kind of a big milestone, so I thought I would make a special video, and I got a fantastic one for today. It is 10 more deck ideas for Commander, and this is a special version that I've been working on for quite some time. This is the Challenge edition of 10 deck ideas, and Challenge is sort of a double entendre here, where these are very challenging deck ideas to build around. And also I am challenging you, my viewers, my subscribers. These are 10 ideas that are not going to be easy. They are very challenging deck ideas that are going to require some serious strategy and skill and deck building prowess to actually make a sustainable deck with. And even if you just want a deck like this in your collection, I really think that everyone should have at least one deck in their collection that is a goat tribal or a stuffy doll deck or some sort of weird janky deck where you're trying to pull off some crazy combo. And once in a while, everyone pulls out their janky, weird combo deck or some crazy idea that they have and just has a really fun and interesting game with it. I think that everyone should have at least one deck like that in their collection. So here's 10 ideas for you if you want a deck like that in your collection, or if you just really like a good challenge in deck building, here's some ideas that you can definitely run with. So starting out at number 1 is off-color tribal, and I mentioned this when I did my mono black elves deck, my Nadir and Miara deck. And really that's not that off color. At the time it was very off color. Making a mono black elves deck, it was very challenging. They did come out with a lot of really great mono black support for an elves deck, actually in Kaldheim, the very next set. So I don't even know if that's an off-color tribal anymore, but basically the idea being play a tribe where you're not using the main color. So for example, wizard tribal, but you're not playing blue. Cleric tribal, but you're not playing white. How about a goblin deck where you're not playing red? I don't even know if that one's possible, but it's definitely a challenge. Mono white vampires is an interesting one, and there's actually a commander for that, right? Maverin Fane, obviously not very popular commander, but that's a mono white vampires deck. I think that's an interesting one. How about a sliver deck that isn't 5 colors? That's one that I don't see people tackle nearly enough. People automatically assume that you have to play 5 color with slivers. I made a Mardu slivers deck once that was pretty darn good. There's so many slivers in the format that you really don't need to play all 5 colors in order to make a really good deck with it. So just make like a 3-color slivers deck, how about? Or I'm going to add on to this a weird tribe, not just off-color tribal as a challenging idea, but a really weird tribe. I did my Ebon Praetor Thrall tribal deck a little while ago. So Thralls is a very interesting and weird tribe that you could definitely build around. There's a few out there, and for me, I would say at least have one Lord effect. So for example, my Pegasus tribal idea that I came out with in my last 10 deck ideas, you have the one Lord there. Having one Lord effect in your deck is kind of nice. Maybe you could do Crab tribal. That's a very weird and interesting tribe that you could build around. There is enough crabs in the game that you could actually make a crab tribal deck, and they do actually have a card now, Scuttletide, that is a sort of a Lord effect for your crabs, right? 1 and a blue enchantment. You can pay 1 and discard a card to create an 0/3 blue crab creature token, and if you have Delirium, crabs you control get +1/+1 as long as you have 4 more card types in your graveyard. So again, that's what I'm talking about with a Lord effect. Basically, all crabs you control get something, or all Pegasus you control get something. Having at least one effect like that in your tribal deck, it sort of makes it worth it for you to do that, but it's definitely a huge challenge for you to make a crab tribal deck. Coming in at number 2 is the Assemble idea. And again, playing off of the Assemble idea I had in my last 10 cards video where I talked about Kaldra Assemble, and I actually made that deck. It was an Arkham Dagson Kaldra Assemble deck where you're basically assembling pieces of something, right? So what we're looking for is we're looking for cards that basically talk about other cards or care about having other cards in play. And I think the Herald series is really good for this. If you want to build a deck around that, Angel's Herald, Behemoth's Herald, Demon's Herald, Dragon's Herald, and Sphinx's Herald, there's one for each color, and they're all 3 colors, okay? So each of the creatures that they go get are 3-color creatures. So if you were to make this deck, how I would do it is I would put all of them in. I would do this a 5-color deck, so that way you can include all of them. I don't think you want to build around just the one. If you built around, say, Sphinx's Herald, you could go get your Sphinx's Sovereign. That would be just a 3-color deck, but I don't really want to just build around going and getting one thing out of there. I want to build around all of them. So I would do a 5-color deck, put all the heralds in, and put all the creatures in there that they go get. Imperial Archangel, Godsire, Prince of Thralls, Hellkite Overlord, right? You would have all those guys in there. And then probably I would just throw in a whole lot of creatures that are multicolored so that can fulfill all the different colors that you're looking for. So that to me is a deck onto itself. If you're looking for other sort of assemble themes, Urborg Panther is an interesting one, right? You can sacrifice Feral Shadow, Breath Stealer, and Urborg Panther and search your library for Spirit of the Night and put it into play. So you could probably include that one with the Herald series as well. You could do that all in the same deck if you want. The Eye of Vecna, Hand of Vecna, that one also is a new one from Forgotten Realms that you could include in a deck like this with Book of Vile Darkness. And the Bog Brew Witch one you could as well do. Bog Brew Witch, you can tap to search your library for a card named Festering Newt or Bubbling Cauldron. So really there's 3 mono black ones there, right? The Vecna series and the Spirit of the Night one and the Bog Brew one are all mono black ones. So maybe you could even do a mono black deck with all 3 of those in there if you want to. You could do the Herald series. You could do them all together if you want. Maybe that's too much to do in one deck, but there definitely is a lot there to work with. Coming in at number 3, and this is a very interesting one and a very challenging one. I got to say, there is some very challenging ones on this list. And this is one that I got from a combination of an idea I had and also a viewer that commented on one of my videos. It was a 10 cards video where I was talking about Time and Tide, and I was trying to make a case for how that card you could play in a commander game because someone cast their Teferi's Protection and you cast Time and Tide and all of their creatures phase back in and then die to the board wipe that they're trying to protect their creatures from or whatever the case may be. And someone commented on that video, they said what really works great against Teferi's Protection is skipping an untap step. So for those who don't know, phasing works at the untap step. So on untap, anything that has phasing will phase out. And if you phase things out, like with a Teferi's Protection, those things phase back in on your untap. So if you have a card like Sands of Time that says each player skips their untap step, those things won't phase back in. If someone casts a Teferi's Protection and you have a Sands of Time in play, on their untap step, they don't have an untap step. So nothing phases back in. They just phased out all their permanents and their permanents stay phased out for as long as Sands of Time remains in play. And that's everything. That's not just their creatures. Their lands, everything phased out, so nothing's going to phase back in because they're skipping their untap step. Stasis is another way you can do this where everyone skips their untap step. There is not a lot of ways to force your opponents to skip their untap step. Shisado, Whispering Hunter is another way. I mean, this is a really challenging one, I gotta say, but man, is it good. And then essentially what you would do after you make everyone skip their untap steps, you would put cards that I have named in my 10 cards videos frequently, like Reality Ripple or like Vodolian Illusionist would be a great one, where you just start phasing out all their stuff and their stuff won't phase back in because they don't have an untap step. Shimmer is a really fantastic one where now their lands are going to phase out, which can be a little annoying, but if their lands don't phase back in, now it becomes an Armageddon effect. Equipoise is another really interesting card that would work fantastically in this deck that I was trying to figure out a way to use this really odd card, and this is a great way to use it. 2 and a white enchantment at the beginning of your upkeep. For each land target player controls in excess of the number you control, choose a land that player controls. Then the chosen permanents phase out. Repeat this process for artifacts and creatures. Now, on your turn, you're going to phase out a bunch of their stuff, but then immediately on their turn, all their stuff phases back in on their untap. So this card's not super great because it just phases out their stuff on your turn. But if you have that skip untap effect, now you're just going to choose a bunch of their stuff and it's going to phase out and then not phase back in. So you basically get to just choose a bunch of their stuff that gets permanently removed. So definitely a very interesting deck that you could run with, but super difficult, I think. You know, this is a tough one for sure. I don't know if I would want to tackle this myself, but anyone out there that wants a really challenging and really interesting deck idea, there it is. Coming in at number 4, and this idea is going to be completely around the card GROZOTH, which is a very interesting card. Has Transmute, one of my favorite abilities. That's why I've come across this card a lot. I imagine a lot of other people have probably never seen this card before. 6 blue, 9 mana, 9/9 with Defender. Okay, you can pay 4 and it loses Defender till end of turn, but that's probably not why you want to use this card. And in fact, you probably don't even want to use the Transmute on this card. This card has an incredibly powerful ability of whenever GROZOTH enters the battlefield, you may search your library for any number of cards that have mana value 9, reveal them and put them into your hand. Being able to search your deck for any number of cards is of course very powerful, but they have to have mana value of 9. So how do you use that? How do you use that very powerful ability? And I thought, man, wouldn't it be great if you could get this guy into play and you wouldn't have to cast him, right? You could just cheat him into play with a sneak attack type of effect, you know, through the breach, something like that. All he has to do is hit the table in order for you to get that effect. He can immediately die. That doesn't matter. Then you go search your deck for any number of cards with mana value 9, and there are 72 mana value 9 cards in the format currently, so that's obviously more than enough to put in your deck. Doesn't really matter what they are because you're just going to discard them to an effect like Nahiri's Wrath. 2 and a red sorcery as an additional cost to cast Nahiri's Wrath, discard X cards. Nahiri's Wrath deals damage equal to the total mana value of the discarded cards to each of up to X target creatures and or planeswalkers. Now you can cast Nahiri's Wrath and, no pun intended, wrath everyone's boards, right? You can just kill every creature in play or planeswalker, but we really want to win the game with an effect like this. We don't want to just discard all of these 9 mana value things to nothing. I think probably you would put a no maximum hand size spellbook type of effect in this deck, right? A bunch, Reliquary Tower, as many as you can, so that once you fill your hand with 50 plus cards that cost 9 mana value or more, you're obviously just going to keep them in your hand. We can put Pyromancy in this deck, 2 red enchantment, pay 3, discard a card at random. Pyromancy deals damage to any target equal to the mana value of the discarded card. So now we can start chucking this damage at our opponents. 3 mana to do 9 damage. I mean, you're discarding a card at random, but every card in your hand costs 9 mana value. So this just becomes 3 mana, do 9 damage to an opponent. That's going to close out the game pretty quick. So there's a couple of ways that you can fill your hand with all these super expensive cards and then use them to discard and throw the damage around, right? That's basically what I'm thinking here. You know, being able to search your library for up to like 40, 50 cards and fill your hand with them is an incredibly powerful ability. And then once we do that, now we have a handful of really expensive cards that we can then throw around to other effects. You know, maybe you can throw them around for damage. Maybe you can throw them around for other reasons. I don't know. Maybe you can discard them and do a recursion theme. This is your challenge, right? This is an idea that I have that maybe someone can run with and make a deck with. I think it would be a really interesting one. Coming in at number 5, exile your opponent's library. And this is another idea that I got from one of my favorite cards, Bitter Ordeal, that I mentioned in my abilities that I want Wizards of the Coast to revisit video. Has the entirely unique ability of Gravestorm, which only exists on this card and no other, which is whenever you cast this spell, copy it for each permanent put into a graveyard this turn. You may choose new targets for the copy. So if you had an infinite loop of, say, Animate Dead and Leonin Relic Warder, you're constantly having that creature go to the graveyard and come back over and over and over again. So you get infinite Gravestorm triggers essentially, and you can just exile your opponent's entire library. So that's the combo-y way to do it. But I just think it would be interesting to make a deck where I just exile my opponent's libraries, not mill, right? We're not milling here. It's I search my opponent's library for cards and exile them. And there are lots of cards that do this. Earwig Squad, if it enters the battlefield and its prowl cost was paid, you get to search your opponent's library for 3 cards and exile them. Nightmare Incursion, 5 and a black. Sorcery, search target player's library for up to X cards, where X is the number of swamps you control, and exile them, right? So if I have 7 or 8 swamps, now I get to search for 7 or 8 cards, exile them. Sadistic Sacrament, 3 black mana. Search target player's library for up to 3 cards and exile them. However, it has a kicker of 7, and if the spell was kicked, you can search that player's library for up to 15 cards and exile them. How about one of the worst cards ever printed, Denying Wind? 7 blue, 9 mana sorcery. Search target player's library for up to 7 cards and exile them. I think this deck probably likely would be blue and black. Supreme Inquisitor is a great one. 3 blue, human wizard. Tap 5 untapped wizards you control. Search target player's library for up to 5 cards and exile them. You could build the deck around this card and do a wizard tribal theme, because this is a repeatable effect, which I think is good. Or you could build the deck around Never Ending Torment. 4 black sorcery. Search target player's library for X cards, where X is the number of cards in your hand, and exile them. And of course it has epic, which means for the rest of the game, you can't cast spells. And at the beginning of each upkeep, you're going to copy this spell. So for the rest of the game, your hand is going to keep getting fuller and fuller and fuller because you're going to keep drawing and you can't cast spells, and you keep exiling cards from your opponent's libraries every turn. So this would be a great way to close out the game with. And then obviously you could do the Praetor's Grasp. You know, I'm already exiling cards from my opponent's library, maybe Gaunty. So why not play some of those cards while I'm at it? There's a lot of different ways you can go with this, but I just thought it would be really interesting. Instead of I mill my opponents, a lot of people do that. Why not put in a whole bunch of cards where I'm exiling my opponent's libraries? And the best part about this strategy is all of these effects, you get to search target player's library for cards. You're not just milling random cards into their graveyard. You're going into their library and taking out the best cards, whatever their win cons may be, and exiling them. So you're really hosing them hardcore. Maybe you're taking out the removal so they can't remove some of the stuff that you have in place. Maybe you're taking out the counter spells so they can't stop you from doing what you want to do. So this is actually a pretty viable strategy here, because I think being able to exile all your opponent's best cards out of their library is going to make it a lot easier for you to close out the game. Coming in at number 6 is Off-Color Theme. And I got the idea for this one from, again, another viewer who commented on one of my videos that he had a mono green control deck, which is really interesting. So basically the idea is, instead of off-color tribal, off-color theme. So I'm doing a certain theme that is really common in a certain color, but I'm doing it in another color, and I'm not playing that other color. You know, I did my Firja white-black control deck, which is sort of off color. Like it's difficult to play a control deck without blue because you don't have the counter spells. But it's interesting, that deck, because there actually is a fair amount of black and white counter spells. That's what makes that deck so fun and interesting. And sort of the idea with that deck was I was putting a lot of cards in that deck that were off color. Like, for example, white spells that gain control of other creatures. You know, you don't see that much in white. There are a few spells. You know, I'm going to gain control of my opponent's creatures is typically a blue or red theme. So if you do that in other colors, that's an off-color theme. I did my white card draw deck idea. You know, I thought Darien was a great commander for that. Why not make a mono white deck that just draws cards like crazy using cards like Skull Clamp and Inspiring Commander? Or how about, this is a really interesting idea, white or blue deal damage, right? Obviously red deals damage to stuff really well. Not a lot of other colors do. So why not do a deck where you're dealing lots of damage, but doing it in white or blue or maybe black? There are cards in those colors that deal damage. So it would be really interesting to do a deck where you're dealing damage to all your opponent's creatures, or maybe even to your opponent's faces, without using red. So that's the idea here, is I'm making an off-color theme. I'm doing a theme that you normally see in other colors, and I'm not using the typical colors you see. Mono green stacks is another one that I actually had a viewer ask about. There's another interesting one. Maybe make stacks without white, I think probably is going to be the tough one to do. Just a very interesting and challenging idea if you want to tackle it. Moving on to number 7 is Alt Win Condition. And this one I think people are familiar with, but I'm not talking about the easy ones, okay? I'm not talking about Approach of the Second Sun, which people use in decks all the time. I'm not talking about Azor's Elocutors that people use in decks all the time in their Pillow Fort decks, or maybe their Atraxa decks, stuff like that. I'm talking about the difficult ones, okay? There are 26, from what I could find, alt win conditions where you just win the game, essentially, right? You meet some condition and you win the game, but not the easy ones, okay? Not chance and encounter that you're just obviously going to put in your deck that's flipping coins anyway. Not Epic Struggle that you can just throw in any deck that has lots of creatures, right? Epic Struggle is not a card that you have to build your deck around. You just put it in any deck where you have lots of creatures, and maybe you're going to win, maybe you're not. Felidar Sovereign is obviously one that you could just put in any deck. You don't build your deck around that card. That's too easy. I want challenging ones. Helix Pinnacle, maybe, like that's one where, I don't know, that's not super challenging. Miles Aria, maybe that one's, now we're getting a little more challenging, right? At the beginning of your upkeep, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. If you control a creature with power 5 or greater, then you gain 10 life. If you control a creature with power 10 or greater, then you win the game if you control a creature with power 20 or greater. For me, I thought that was a great inclusion in a Jared Carthalion deck because you're already going towards that anyway. So now with your Jared Carthalion, as soon as you get the 20 power on him, you just win the game. But again, you know, you don't have to build your deck around it. Mortal Kombat is another one that you don't build your deck around. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 20 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you win the game. So you just put that in any deck where you are playing a graveyard theme, right? Near-Death Experience. Okay, so now we're getting a little more challenging here. 2 white, white, white enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have exactly 1 life, you win the game. So that's interesting. This gets a little more challenging, right? But now, of course, you can just easily manipulate your life to get at 1 life on your upkeep. A Selenia, Dark Angel, obviously, you know, I think this is probably an auto-include in that deck for that reason, because it's really easy to manipulate your life and win with it. So maybe not quite challenging enough. If you want to get a little more challenging, maybe Biovisionary. 1, a green and a blue human wizard, 2/3. At the beginning of the end step, if you control 4 or more creatures named Biovisionary, you win the game, right? So you need 4 Biovisionaries in play, and of course you can only have 1 in your deck, so you got to get this guy in play, and then you need clone effects, right? You need copy effects. So that's going to be a little more challenging. A really difficult one though is Barren Glory. 4 white, white enchantment at the beginning of your upkeep. If you control no permanents other than Barren Glory and have no cards in hand, you win the game. That's a tough one. That's one that you definitely have to build your deck around, right? This is what I'm talking about. Some of these alt win cons just fit already in a deck with what you're doing. Barren Glory does not. What deck is going to be getting rid of all your permanents and discarding your hand? This is not going to fit in any deck. Particularly, it's a card that you absolutely have to build your deck around. And this is one that's going to be really, really challenging because you have to make it so that you get your Barren Glory into play, and then somehow you have to sacrifice or exile or destroy all of your other permanents other than Barren Glory, and you have to discard your hand. You could use a Jokalops type of effect. That would definitely work. There are some red effects that destroy all artifacts, creatures, and lands, but leave the enchantments alone. So that's one way you could do it. There's definitely some hoops to jump through for sure. It would be a difficult one, and my hat would be off to you if you could pull that off in a game. Coming in at number 8, and now we're getting into the really challenging stuff. These last 3 are definitely not for the faint of heart. The Grandeur ability. And for those who don't know what the Grandeur ability is, it is a ability printed in probably one of my favorite sets, Future Sight. Discard another card with that name. Okay, so basically the idea was if you have a legendary creature, right? You have a legendary creature in play, you can't play one that's in your hand. If it's in your hand, you can't play it. So why not take advantage of having that, and you can discard it to the one that's already in play, right? So all of these, and there's one for each color, has that Grandeur ability where I can just discard that card in my hand with the same name. Since I can't play it anyway, why not take advantage of it? I think it's a really interesting ability. However, in Commander, obviously you can't have cards with the same name. So how do you build around it? So for example, Korlosh, Heir to Blackblade, which is one I've been asked about a few times for me to make a deck tech on, has discard another card named Korlosh, Heir to Blackblade, search your library for up to 2 swamp cards, and put them on the battlefield tapped. That's a really powerful ability, but how do you have a Korlosh in play and one in your hand at the same time, right? It's a really tough one, and I'm not saying the challenge is build a Korlosh deck. I'm not saying the challenge is build a Lanessa deck. I'm saying the challenge is build around the Grandeur ability, okay? And I think the only way you can do that is a clone effect. So I have my Lanessa in play, and Lanessa has a really good Grandeur ability, I think. Some of these are actually worth building around, and some of them not so much. Lanessa, you discard another card named Lanessa Zephyr Mage, and target player returns a creature they control to owner's hand, then repeats the process for artifact, enchantment, and land. So they have to return a creature a artifact, an enchantment, and a land every time you do this. That's pretty darn good. And I think the best way to do this is a clone effect or a token copy effect. So what you would have to do is you would have to clone your Lanessa. Obviously, one of them would die. You would choose your Lanessa, the actual real Lanessa, to go to the graveyard. Then you'd have to return it to your hand. So now it's in your hand, and then you can discard it. So very challenging. And can you actually build this as your commander? Like a Lanessa or a Corlash, for example. I have Lanessa and I have a Corlash as my commander. Can I build a deck around it? I don't know. I don't know if you can actually do that because, you know, if I'm building a mono black Corlash deck, can I clone it? There's not really any clone effects in mono black. Blue is really good at copying and creating clone effects and that kind of stuff. So Lanessa is going to be great at that, but not so good at returning stuff from your graveyard to your hand, which you're going to want to do, right? You're going to want that return creatures from your graveyard to your hand effect over and over and over again so that you can use that grandeur ability more than once. You don't want to just use it once. That's not a very big payoff. We want a big payoff for all the hoops we're jumping through, right? So I want to be able to return my commander or that grandeur card. I want to be able to return from my graveyard to my hand over and over and over again so that I can discard it over and over and over again. You know, Lanessa's effect, if I can do that 5 or 6 times, like that's a game ender for a lot of people, right? They're not going to have any lands or creatures or anything in play. So I think that's definitely worth it. Some of these like Oris or Torox Bladewing, you know, is that worth it to jump through all those hoops for that grandeur effect? I don't think so. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but it definitely is incredibly challenging. You know, which way you want to go about it is entirely up to you, but definitely challenging, right? The challenge here being you're actually using that grandeur ability. Coming in at number 9, and now we're really taking the train to Crazy Town this time. This is probably the wackiest idea I ever came up with for a deck idea, I think. Grim Reminder. Okay, and for everyone who hasn't seen this card before, which is probably a lot of people, 2 and a black instant. Search your library for a non-land card and reveal it. Each opponent who casts a spell this turn with the same name as that card loses 6 life, then you shuffle your library. And you can pay black and a black and return Grim Reminder from your graveyard to your hand, activate only during your upkeep. So the idea here being I build my deck around this card, okay? I'm killing my opponents with this card. Can it be done? I don't know. I first came up with this idea because I noticed a lot of people playing the same cards. Like everyone's got Rhystic Study in their deck or Soul Ring, you know, whatever the card may be. If a lot of people are playing all the same cards, then now I can put those cards in my deck. And when someone casts a Soul Ring, I cast Grim Reminder, search my library for my Soul Ring and reveal it. And that player loses 6 life. Right? And that's how you would win the game. It's incredibly challenging, I know. The upside here being you're going to be putting all the best cards in your deck, right? You're going to have the most powerful, good stuff type cards in your deck because you're going to be putting in your deck what everyone else is playing, right? You're waiting for your opponents to cast that card so that you can go, aha, I have a Rhystic Study in my deck. I'm revealing it. You lose 6 life, then I shuffle it back in. And of course, the only way this is a viable strategy is because of that second ability where I can just pay black and a black and return it to my hand, right? So once you get Grim Reminder in your hand, and of course we're in black, so that shouldn't be an issue. Now I can just keep returning it to my hand every turn and using it over and over again. Yes, I know this is a really far-fetched idea and it's incredibly difficult. It definitely is challenging, no question. I think Rishadan Pawn Shop would be an interesting card in this deck. You know, pay 2 and shuffle target non-token permanent you control into owner's library. So now if I have my Soul Ring, I cast it already, it's on the battlefield. Now if my opponent casts their Soul Ring, I can shuffle my Soul Ring into my library so that I can then go get it with my Grim Reminder. You know, I mean, it's just such a wacky, crazy idea. I don't know. I think it would be a really interesting build around. You're basically building your deck around the card Grim Reminder and trying to kill your opponents with that. Very challenging idea. Yes, I know. But this is the challenge edition, so I'm not letting you guys off easy. And number 10 on this list is Booby Trap. Another very challenging deck idea. You are building your deck around Booby Trap and killing your opponents with that. So Booby Trap is one of the neatest cards I think ever made. 6 mana artifact. As Booby Trap enters the battlefield, choose an opponent and a card name other than a basic land card name. The chosen player reveals each card they draw. When the chosen player draws a card with the chosen name, sacrifice Booby Trap. If you do, it deals 10 damage to that player. So I was considering this card when I was looking at things to put in an Oscar deck. I thought, that's an interesting card in an Oscar deck because I can play it. My opponent takes 10 damage. It gets sacrificed, goes to my graveyard. Then I can recur it, make 2 token copies of it with my Oscar. And now I do 10 more. I have 2 of them. So now I'm going to do a total of 30 damage. That's pretty good. The thing though is you have to know what your opponent's drawing. That's the important part. You need a Lantern of Insight. I think I would probably do a Lantern of Insight strategy where I know what's on top of my opponent's library. I know what they're going to draw next, so I just name that card, right? You don't want to have to guess. You want to know what's on top of your opponent's library so that you're guaranteed doing that 10 damage. Basically, this deck is, I'm killing my opponents with Booby Trap. All of them, right? I'm going to kill all of my opponents with Booby Trap. How are you going to do that? I think it works in an Oscar deck, so maybe you can do it there. Maybe you can create token copies, or you can do a recursion theme with Goblin Welder. I think probably Goblin Welder goes in an Oscar deck already, so I can keep using my Booby Trap over and over and over again. Lantern of Insight also can go in that deck, right? You get to look at all of your opponent's libraries, the top of their libraries at all times, so you could keep recurring the Booby Trap and naming whatever card they're going to draw next. So I think it works there. Maybe even put Pull from Eternity in that deck, one of my favorite cards, so that if you exile that Booby Trap, now you can chuck it back in your graveyard so you can use it again. More interesting way to go is maybe a Shroom deck where I can recur it from my graveyard. So an artifact recursion theme I think you would need here as well. You definitely need to know what's on top of your opponent's library. That's for sure. Wand of Denial. There's another way. There's lots of ways to look at the top card of your opponent's libraries. Obviously, Mishra's Bauble is going to work great in either version of this deck. But I think with Shroom, what I like about it is I can just keep blinking my Shroom over and over again, right? With a Conjurer's Closet or other blink effect where I'm blinking my Shroom over and over again so I can constantly keep getting that Booby Trap back. And the other awesome thing that you can do in the Shroom version of this deck is put Magister Sphinx in there. And is this cheating a little bit? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. You're making a really interesting deck here already. Magister Sphinx enters the battlefield. You make an opponent's life total into 10, and then you blow up your Booby Trap and kill them. And then because you have blink effects, now you can Conjurer's Closet your Magister Sphinx. It comes back into play and you go on to the next opponent and make their life total 10, get that Booby Trap back, and kill them as well, and so on and so forth. I think that's actually not bad. This is a challenging deck. There's a lot of hoops you can jump through, but man, I blink my Magister Sphinx, turn my opponent's life total 10, and then kill them with the Booby Trap. That's pretty darn good. That's actually not that many hoops to jump through. I think this is definitely a viable deck idea and a very, very interesting one. I really like this one a lot. Basically, the deck idea is I'm killing my opponents with Booby Trap, right? Just like you would with a Stuffy Doll deck. In a Stuffy Doll deck, you're killing your opponents with your Stuffy Doll. That's the idea of the deck. The idea of this deck is I'm killing my opponents with my Booby Trap, and whether or not you want to attack with your commander or do them damage other ways is entirely up to you. I mean, it's just a fun, interesting idea. But if you want the challenge of it, the challenge is I kill my opponents with Booby Trap and nothing else. So that is it. That is 10 more deck ideas for you guys. The challenge edition. These are some really challenging ideas that you can run with. I just think it's fun and interesting to have, say, I have a Grim Reminder deck where I kill my opponents with Grim Reminder, or I kill my opponents with Booby Trap, or I have a Crab Tribal deck. I just think it's fun and interesting to have decks like that. So my challenge is to you guys to go out and make decks like this. And just like with all my other 10 deck ideas video, I will be making one myself, and there will be a poll in the description of this video for you guys to vote on which one of these ideas you actually want me to make. It's going to be challenging, no question, but of course I'm always up for a challenge. So pick the deck that you guys want to actually see me make, and I will actually make a deck with one of these ideas. And thank you to all of my viewers, all my subscribers. Didn't think I'd get to 20,000 already. It hasn't even been a year of this channel's existence. Thank you to my patrons as well, especially. I really appreciate the support you guys have given me, and I really like the interaction there. And for anyone else who is a viewer or subscriber, if you want, you can go click on my Patreon link in the description as well and join my Patreon if you just can't get enough of my content. There's more of it on my Patreon if you're looking for it. But that is it for today, and thank you for tuning in.